Hello, sword people. Welcome to the Sword Guy podcast. This is your host, Dr. Guy Windsor, consulting swordsman, teacher, and writer. Join me for interviews with historical martial arts instructors and experts from a wide range of related disciplines as we discuss swords, history, training, and bringing the joy of historical martial arts into our modern lives. I hope you enjoy this greatest hit episode of the show. You can find all the episodes at swordschool.com/podcast, and there's a direct link in the description to this episode's show notes. On with the show. And I'm here today with Dr. Eleanor Janega, who none other than Dan Snow refers to as the most awesome medieval historian in the world, which is perhaps her greatest claim to fame. She's also a guest lecturer at LSE in the Department of International History, and she's published all sorts of articles which you may or may not find interesting, like Suspect Women, Prostitution, Reputation and Gossip in 14th Century Prague, or Lies, Damn Lies and Bohemians in History Today. She has a PhD in history. She has an excellent blog called Going Medieval, and you can find her online at patreon.com/Going Medieval. So without further ado, Eleanor, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Guy. It's such a delight to be here.
Well, thank you. Now, just so we can orient ourselves, whereabouts are you at the moment?
So I am in the great city of London, although I am south of the river, so technically, for medieval purposes, I would not be within the city limits, but things being as they are, I count at this point.
Fair enough. Am I right in thinking you came over here from Chicago?
Yes. So I am originally from Seattle. I did undergraduate work in Chicago, and then I moved over here when it became clear that I was going to become a European medieval historian, because this is where we tend to keep it. So yes. I thought it would make my life easier if I could actually be around the documents.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the arms and armor and artifacts that we find interesting have been bought by Americans and taken overseas.
That is unfortunately the case. Yes.
Although actually for us, many of the most important manuscripts for us are actually in America, which is very frustrating.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so as you said, you're a medieval historian. Mm-hmm. This is a dream job for many of my students. Mm-hmm. How did that come about?
So I was just your average undergraduate history major, and I was at Loyola University of Chicago, which has an extraordinarily strong medieval program. And I had no idea that this is what I wanted to specialize in. I actually went in a dedicated Sinophile and extremely interested in Chinese history in particular. Okay. And then I was swayed and misled by a number of wonderful medieval historians there, including the great Barbara Rosenwein, who is very celebrated. She came up with the conception of medieval communities, which is something that we use. Teresa Grostiez, who is an absolutely fantastic French medieval historian. And basically, when you're just around a lot of people who are doing incredible work, it's sort of infectious.
Yes.
And so, also Alan Franson, I have to mention as well, who does a lot of incredible work within the department. So one thing kind of led to another. I moved to Prague for a while. Then I got really swayed the wrong way. And I basically thought, well, what if I kind of modeled my entire life around being a giant nerd about 14th century Prague? And that's how I kind of ended up here.
I visited Prague, and it has a certain medieval vibe to it for sure.
It certainly does, yes. So
why not Prague? Why London?
Well, part of it is just about speaking English, and also part of it is about just being able to have access to a lot of different documents and a lot of different flights to places, to be honest.
Right.
It's easier for me at the minute to be in London, although it's always on the cards. I'm always on the verge of just moving to the Czech Republic. It's one of those things where it really depends. I go over an awful lot for research because a lot of my research hinges on things that are in the Národní knihovna or the Czech National Library. But having said that, the British Library is just an absolute trove of manuscripts. So having access to that is kind of amazing.
So, what are your main research interests? If we found you in the British Library collections, what would you be looking at?
So I am a social historian primarily, and I am a late medievalist. So I'm kind of covering the 13th century up to about the 16th. And I am interested in apocalypticism, sexualities, cities, propaganda, and kind of things like I'm really interested in various heretical movements, this sort of a thing. Basically, my joke is that I'm interested in sex and death. Because nothing else really matters. So I work on all of those things, but obviously, what I'm kind of trying to do is construct a generalized conception of what society sort of looks like. In the late medieval Europe generally, Holy Roman Empire more specifically, but late medieval Europe generally. And, it helps us to kind of explain our world if we understand how it is that the social fabric was knitted together before we got to the modern period, I think.
Excellent. Now, I know that quite a few of the people listening will be doing martial arts from late 14th and 15th century Holy Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So, would you care to kind of, I know it's tough on a podcast, but kind of summarize your view of how society was working back then?
Okay, so
where swords fitted into that?
Oh gosh.
No pressure. No
Yeah,
pressure.
okay, well that's fine. Just do that in a couple minutes, shall I?
Yeah. That's right. So 10 years work in a 5-minute soundbite. Go.
So, I know that, as most of your listeners are going to know, that, the Holy Roman Empire is one of these great examples of where you get a lot of the fantastic manuscripts in particular that let us know how people were actually fighting. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the late medieval period and when we consider martial arts is that it is actually a time when we get to begin to learn the actual mechanics about fighting. Because up until that point, we have a lot of things about, who went to war with whom. You have a lot of kind of hyperbole, and, stories about arrows going through eyes and, Clovis chopping off someone's head with an axe and this sort of thing. But, one doesn't necessarily know how people were individually going about it. So, of course, in and of itself, how people fight, if you really want to know more about that, you have to go to the late medieval period. But one of the things about swords generally and fighting generally that interests me is it is particularly kind of classed to a certain extent, obviously. And what I'm really interested in differences between classes in the medieval period and how we define various social groups. So obviously, like just the opportunity to have a sword tells you a lot about a person. Who is literally allowed to walk around with a sword is a really big deal. Because so you'll have, for example, stories from the Hussite rebellions in Prague in the 15th century, and you'll see, city guards and that sort of thing who are defending with stuff like rocks and sticks. They'll be up on a wall just being like, I don't know, throw rocks at them. This is what we've got going, which tells you a lot about like who's on the side of the Hussites and, versus, people on horseback who have really nice horses, really nice swords. And that tells you a lot about who thinks what about religion, how these things are defended and fought for physically. And so you can never really get that far from swords and who has them if one of the things that you want to talk about is the stratification of society, because swords are this definitive symbol of who gets to fight and how. Of course, there's lots of different ways of fighting, and archers are something that I'm always really obsessed with for the same reason, because I love the kind of communal aspects of archery in the late medieval period, how it's kind of like a way of socializing for people in towns and that kind of thing. Archery practice. Big shout out. I spent a bunch of time the other week playing with online. There's a zoomable map it's called the August map of London. It's not actually made by the guy August who thought it was made, but it's a 17th century map of London. And if you look at all the outskirts of the city, you see a bunch of people practicing archery. Yeah. So it's got a map of town, but it shows you what people are kind of doing in their not necessarily spare time, but you see a bunch of people doing laundry, you see a bunch of people walking dogs, and you see people practicing archery. And I think that's such, just a great example of how martial arts are this really everyday part of life, but also a really pleasurable part of life for people. I lived in Tokyo for a while as a modern example. And one of the, great pleasures was to go to the parks on Sundays, and everyone would be out there doing kendo or practicing kyudo. So they've got like their giant bows and they've got their swords, and they're out there just like having a lovely time hitting each other with swords. And it really kind of hammered this home for me, that the fact that this is obviously a very practical thing, a way of organizing the world, and it's a skill, but it's also a form of pleasure. And I think that's something that we really overlook, because we tend to just say, oh, wars are fought in this way, fighting happens in this way. But there's also, this instinctual kind of hook into the pleasure of really gaining mastery over something. And I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, interesting. I'm thinking of Filippo Vadi, who in the 1480s wrote a lovely little book, and he explicitly says that the art is for kings and nobles and knights, and not for peasants who are fit only to carry heavy loads. The fact that he felt it necessary to say that would suggest that perhaps there were peasants who were thinking about picking up swords.
Absolutely. So I think you are referring to De Arte Gladiatori de Mercandi. No.
Oh, well done, knowing that.
Hey, I know things. It's true. And it is one of those things where it's like, it's so explicit. Sometimes, often when you're speaking to people about the medieval period, they don't kind of realize how incredibly restricted the ability to fight with a sword is. Because the way that we tend to think about the medieval period is in this sort of fantasy way. The major way that most of us relate to it is through what we refer to as medievalisms. So stuff like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. When people say, oh, well, this is what the world was like, and it's based on these kind of depictions of, the knightly class, of nobles, of people who certainly did have swords. And, it's one of those things that you'll talk to people and they'll be like, oh, yeah, well, people were just carrying around swords, hacking at each other, something that has been said to me. And it's like, well, no. And people sometimes, when they get quite romantic about medieval swordplay, they will tend to say, oh, well, it's this great thing that everyone was involved in. It's like, well, no, 80% of the population of medieval Europe were peasants, and they had absolutely no recourse to swords and would get massive trouble if that was something that they took upon themselves. And you can tell, though, when Filippo Vadi is talking about this, that this seems to be something that's softening up. So his feeling that he needs to underline the fact that peasants aren't fit to pick up swords kind of tells you that things are changing. Because if it's just a self-obvious thing, a lot of the time it's never mentioned. And it's when you get hints like that, that's when it shows us that things are becoming a little bit more mobile, things are becoming a little bit more shaken up. And, there also is a lot of tension going on at the time because of stuff like, Italy, the Italian city-states had kind of come through a period of massive war at the end of the 14th century. You have things like the Roman Republic, you had lots of civil wars. And currently, when Filippo Vadi is writing, you've got the Hussite wars going on. So there's a lot of noble tension about, peasants getting a little bit uppity and deciding that they can do things using martial arts. And so there is a real tension there that he is directly talking about.
Yes. Oh, good. that was a very interesting and comprehensive answer. Thank you. Okay, now I need to throw something that's potentially a little triggering at you, so brace yourself.
Okay.
In sword circles, we are well aware that in the 19th century, the fencing master and historian of fencing called Egerton Castle famously dismissed the rough, untutored fighting of the Middle Ages. Okay? Well, to be super fair to Castle, he wasn't probably aware of the manuscripts that we're working from today. He was, as far as he could probably see, the fencing record began in the 16th century. So he would probably assume that before that there was nothing, and then suddenly, also he wasn't a trained historian in the modern sense at all. So we now know, of course, that medieval martial arts are sophisticated and elegant and so on. In your article, Lies, Damn Lies and Bohemians, you call into question, I quote, the modern belief that the Middle Ages was a time of ignorance and superstition. So what was it like, and how do you know?
Aha, yes. So this is one of those things. So this gets right to the heart of one of my personal bugbears. So you
Yeah,
well done on
you
finding the
go
thing
for it.
that bothers me the most in the world. So there is particularly a modern conception that it's really tied with the Enlightenment. And there is a specific thing within the Enlightenment and a tendency to say, and I'm afraid Voltaire is to blame for this, that the medieval period in general is a backward time. It's a time when there was no sophisticated anything happening, whether that be thought or societal, cohesion, or it can extend to warfare as well. So nothing that happened in the medieval period was interesting or worth your time. And there are a few reasons for this. One of it is a modern tendency to pat ourselves on the back for being so very clever. And
Yes, I've come across
everybody really likes to believe that we are kind of standing at the top of a pyramid and that we know more than everyone else. And the medieval period is sort of looked upon as a time when that was not in fact happening. That is kind of fed into by a tendency to look down upon religious people at this juncture. So there is this consideration because, especially within medieval Europe, almost everyone is Christian. Obviously there are huge Jewish populations. There's huge Muslim populations in places like Sicily and what is now Spain. But you're looking at a bunch of very Christian people who are very devout believers in God. And that in and of itself is something that people take to mean that there's no kind of good thinking going on. There's no, and so you can't possibly be both a Christian and be doing any kind of thought that's worthwhile, which is hilarious because, there are absolutely stunning geniuses around the shop, like, Thomas Aquinas or Hildegard of Bingen, or, I could just throw out names all day long of these people who, I'm not fit to carry bathwater for. And they have much more sophisticated ways of looking at the world. But there is this kind of knock-on effect there. So, even if it's not just something like intellectual thought that we're talking about, it will be things like warfare, because, I'm sure that you've kind of heard about the conception of the military revolution as well. Which is something that people really like. And people really like it because they like the fact that there are certain tactics that are gone back to that are seen as being more Roman, because part and parcel with this belief that nothing good is happening in the Middle Ages is this lionization of and aggrandizement of Romans. In particular, we do this for a couple of reasons. In the first place, we like empires because we have empires. And so we like to find them other places. And when we say, oh, you can tell that a society is good and a society is advanced if they've got a standing army, they're taking over other places, hostily, and they're extorting wealth out of them. That's how you can tell that people really have themselves together. And the Romans are doing that, right? So people like to say, okay, Romans good because they're like us. 1100 years of question marks that you just don't need to look into very deeply. The Renaissance, us, fantastic, and so part of that is saying, oh, you can buy into the military revolution standpoint, where you have going back to Roman tactics and techniques, and taxation to have standing armies, and that also tells you that also martial arts are better the minute that you have that, and that anything before that that's happening on a small scale is bad. And that is all just kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that allows people to be really lazy. It allows us to be self-congratulatory, say, oh, we're so much smarter than these people, and we understand fighting better than these people, and we're more elegant than these people. And it also means that you don't have to go around learning stuff like Latin and a bunch of other languages, and you don't have to squint and learn paleography and check out, textbook from the 14th century or anything like that.
Yeah, because who would want to do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it'd be terrible. So if you just write it off and say, well, this is all barbaric, you never have to look into it. And it allows you to kind of keep your own idea of how the world is, which is you at the top of it, without ever having to do any heavy lifting. So, it's one of these things where it's kind of a vicious cycle, because people like doing it because it makes themselves feel good, and because they feel good about it, they never look into it. So, a lot of the time when you're speaking, I'm sure you're aware of this, when you speak to people about the medieval period, they are sure that it's, 5 people rolling around in the dirt, praying to God, having the plague, and, occasionally getting on horseback. And they think that that's, what 1100 years of history is. When in fact, one of the reasons we're not taught about it and we don't learn about it is that, it's massively complicated. You can't really sit down with, say 12-year-olds in school and say, okay, well, here we go, we're doing medieval Europe, because everything is so intricate. Very many different places have very many different cultures, although that's not necessarily true about late medieval fighting, because we know a lot of it's coming out of the German lands and that sort of thing. So the Italians would be the first to tell you that, but we do kind of have an actual rich opportunity, if we pay more attention to martial arts manuals and things, to see where the common and overlying cultures are. And one of those is among, the elite who get to do sword fighting, because there is this definitive way that they can come together. And so it in and of itself, ironically, would allow people who don't really want to do the work of medieval history to kind of like have a really easy cultural thing to have a look at. So it's a shame when you see it written off like that, but it comes from our baser, wishes to pat ourselves on the back. But it's also not necessarily our fault, because the Enlightenment was a hell of a time. And, it was very important for a lot of things. It gave us a lot of great things, but it also gave us a lot of excuses to get out of doing the homework, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So would you say that sort of the knightly classes of late medieval Europe were sort of like a subculture to themselves?
Yeah, I would certainly say so. I mean, and I think that, so, for example, I'm sure that you're aware of Fiora de Libris, Flos Dilatorum.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, no. Yeah, you're aware. No, yeah, exactly.
That's the one thing I'm perhaps most known for being aware of.
Exactly.
Yes,
So,
I've heard of Fiora.
So, it is this wonderful example, because we start off right now learning that actually where Fiora is writing down now, he learned from a Swabian. Master Johannes.
Hang on.
Yeah, but
he learned from many teachers, both Italian and German.
Yeah, so he
mentions Johannes the Swabian.
And so he mentions him by name, right? So that's not the only one, but this is the one where we're going to put the name out here. And one of the reasons why you do that, why you put just the one name out when it's actually, like it's a community effort. No one learns from one person, right? But why you do that is to kind of hook yourself into a really obvious lineage. So, he is using that as a way of saying, okay, like, I know, like, here's a guy's name that I'm sure you all know. And everyone goes, oh yeah, Master Johannes. Yeah, definitely. We know that. So what that has the effect of doing is saying that Fiore knows what he's talking about. It also means that every other technique that he might have got from anyone else now also gets that seal of approval. And what we're seeing here is kind of a coalescing where you can learn a lot of different little things from a lot of different people, but you stamp it with, it's a very medieval thing to do, is kind of stamp a name on it. You will see this, for example, in lots of philosophical treatises in the medieval period, where the ground is absolutely littered with pseudo philosophers, right? Where people will have pseudo Albertus Magnus, or we'll have pseudo Tertullian, this sort of thing. So it'll be a whole new kind of a philosophy or medical text or that sort of thing. But the way that you get everyone to agree, oh, this is very good, is by putting a name that everyone knows on it, right? So what Fiore is doing here is just like he's turning on that little neon light, saying, hey, you've heard of the guy. And medieval people are like, yes, they love authority,
Yeah, the appeal to authority is like,
yeah, that is absolutely the thing that they love. And so I think it's so great when you see things like that, because it's very clear that in the first place, they're kind of like taking things from, the philosophical community, the intellectuals of the time. And they're saying, these sort of same things can be applied to martial arts. So, it's when you see a kind of like a light bulb moment where it's like, actually, we should get this on paper. It shouldn't just be about you have to kind of like go and show up at someone's house and learn how to fight, which we know is a thing that people do.
Yeah.
But
so this brings up perhaps a sidetrack for you. One of the mysteries is why in the 14th century we begin to see martial arts presented in text, starting with 133 in the maybe 1340s. I think it's the most recent dating for it. Fiore's writing at the end of the 14th century. We have at least one German source that might be from around 1389-ish. And then the German treatise, martial arts treatise tradition sort of kicks off in the 15th century.
Yeah.
So what do you think drove that development?
I mean, I think that one of the things that we're seeing there is we're seeing a higher degree of literacy in general. It's one of these things that I think is quite fun is that you still do see, you begin to see more literacy in the vernacular as opposed to simply in Latin, which a lot of the time obviously, you see more things in vernacular languages and not necessarily Latinate manuscripts, although there are plenty of Latinate manuscripts as well. And that kind of has, I think, there is a traditional kind of medieval thing where when you're writing things in vernacular languages, it tends to be more about people's day-to-day life. So, things like kind of like courtly love literature a lot of the time is written in French. You got Chaucer writing in English, when he wants to tell bawdy stories, so things that, an average person are kind of interested in that you can sort of learn from. This is beginning to get into the vernacular and people enjoy reading in the vernacular. It's kind of like, I think it's sort of part and parcel. And so, people who are definitely from a kind of background where they have the means to be literate, but maybe they don't want to be a priest and they don't want to work that hard at their Latin, because they want to be outside hitting each other with swords, like all the interesting people. So, if you offer people an opportunity to do this in their own language, they go, oh, well, hey, that's a lot easier for me.
Although, do you think that, for example, Fiore Battaglia was actually written for people just to read, or was it written? See, I'm a little suspicious of that because he explicitly says in the introduction that his art is taught in secret and people who he teaches the art to are sworn to secrecy.
I mean, that's the thing, is that I don't think, I wouldn't say that Fiore is just doing it kind of for, okay, so he's such a complicated person. So, I think there, to a certain extent, what we're doing is seeing it's like, well, yeah, okay, so things are kind of like taught in secrecy. And one of the things about doing things like this, manuals like this that you can hand person to person, is it's like, okay, well, this is the expansion of knowledge. This is, in one way, recording what it is that you're doing. It's a way of passing things through things, but it still does have that kind of secret thing. So this is going to keep the commons out, isn't it? Anything written down that you have to read is automatically going to be kind of aimed at a higher class of people. So you have the kind of secrecy there. But it's so... I wish that I had an answer for this. I wish I was the person who was going to crack this thing wide open.
Yeah, but the best questions are the ones that don't have simple answers.
All I could, I could talk about this for hours, and I'll just say, on the one hand, but on the other hand, so it is one of those things where I see that we're simultaneously seeing an opening up of these things, but we have to also keep in mind that while you and I say, and I just did say, that when things are in the vernacular, it reaches a wider group of people. It's like, yeah, but what do we mean by that?
A very wide group.
Yeah, it's like,
and instructive that 133 is actually written in Latin. So there's the earliest manuscript we have on sword fighting is written in Latin. It comes from somewhere in Germany, southern Germany. I think.
This is the Walpurgis manuscript, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And that kind of makes perfect sense, right? Because it's so early that, you would sort of expect to see it more in Latin, and and then we kind of like get out of that as we move further along, which makes sense. But I do see it as one of these things where, to a certain extent, while Latin, I will never be done extolling the virtues of Latin as a language. I think it's great that it's nobody's. I like the fact that it's just this language that sort of existed for communicating ideas when no one spoke it.
Lingua franca.
Yeah, and I think that's really great. Although as an English speaker, I'm doing just fine now with what it is that we're using. but it still is an impediment to a certain extent. Most people are going to have at least church Latin. They're going to know how to say the Our Father in Latin and that sort of thing. But it isn't necessarily what you're going to want to sit down and crack when you're actually trying to learn a practical method of anything. Because a practicality and Latin don't necessarily go hand in hand. In a lot of people's imaginations within the medieval period. So it depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on what sort of audience you're trying to reach with the words that you use and the language that you use. And I do think that the kind of explosion there is tied to that. But I also do think that it's kind of tied with the fact that people kind of have a little bit more leisure time. Often in the later medieval period, the 14th century was a particularly hard one. There were a lot of harvest failures and that sort of a thing. We kind of come back from that a bit in the 15th century, although, that's not always true. People in the Italian city-states have a hell of a time in the late medieval period as well. But you do kind of see an interest specifically in bibliographic culture, people being more interested in stuff like guidebooks, more in be that for travel or for practical things like medicine or martial arts. You do see a kind of expansion of books about more general interest things.
Sure. And many of these German sources we find them in compilations, which include things like medicine and fireworks and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, here's this. Do you find this interesting? Are you interested in fireworks? I am. Are you interested in medicine? And so you see these great compendia. And that's one of the things that I actually really love about medieval manuscripts is you see people kind of just put things in as and when they find them interesting.
Right.
So it's a really great way of saying, oh, okay, well, what are, people's interests? How are they kind of feeling about things day to day? What are they? If they could put together a book about anything that they were interested in, what do they do? Because they literally do that, And it's one of the downsides for, a lot of the time our surviving martial manuscripts are these beautiful things, absolutely gorgeous. You'll see wonderful decorations, they're extremely lavish. And obviously I love those. I'm an absolute mess for anyone who has an illuminated manuscript of anything. But that's also not necessarily the average manuscript in the medieval period. The average one is kind of tiny and little and people are carrying it around. And so a lot of the time we have to keep in mind that the manuscripts that we are left with were left with because they were so remarkable. And people go, oh, well, that's precious.
The same is true with a lot of the swords.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like you have the most remarkable sword. You have the most remarkable manuscript because people say, oh, well, don't burn that. Don't get rid of that. We're going to want that one.
Or don't scrape the ink off and write something, I don't know, about herbalism or something over it.
Yeah, exactly. Don't reuse that. Don't turn that into a book binding for another book. When the monasteries are dissolved or the libraries consolidated like they are in the 17th century, don't get rid of those ones. Move those into the monastery, out of the monastery and into the state library. Those are very beautiful. So there are numbers of reasons why we lose medieval texts all the time. And one of them is that they're just not, I don't necessarily keep all my phone bills, for example. It's just, if things are dull, you don't necessarily keep good records of it. And when things are beautiful and extravagant, you do. And so we know more about martial arts from those texts, but that's true of almost anything that you're talking about in the medieval period. It's going to be the special things that kind of survive, which can be a shame if you're looking for evidence of ordinary people. But, when we're talking about sword fighting, we're never really talking about ordinary people, are we? So, it's fine.
Fair enough. Now, many of the listeners are interested in studying medieval martial arts from medieval sources, and they don't often get access to a professional medieval historian. So can I bug you for some advice for someone who is, they've bought a copy of one of these books and they want to start figuring out how the martial arts work from them. From your perspective as a historian, what would you tell them to do?
If you're going to learn from these manuals, which is certainly a thing that can be done, one of the things,
I would hope so.
Yeah, I know. One of the things you kind of want to get your head around is the way that medieval people introduce things. So when we kind of think of a guidebook, we sort of think of things being like, oh, step 1, step 2, step 3. Medieval people, a good way of putting this is, when you read sort of like 19th century or 18th century novels, you know how something like Moby Dick will be like, here's a chapter of plot, here's an essay, here's a chapter of plot, here's an essay. It's helpful if you kind of think of medieval works like that, where, you'll have some real practical advice, and then, you will have a philosophical kind of way of bringing this together, and then they will tell you how this fits in with Christianity and that sort of thing. Don't let that put you off, but also you need to decide what it is that you're trying to do when you read these books. So do you want to read it all in order and get an overall kind of idea of what they're saying, or are you looking for kind of like practical step-by-step things? There's absolutely no shame if you're using this as a manual and you just want the step-by-step. Feel free to skip ahead. Feels free to skip around. You don't need to like read every kind of philosophical idea. You don't need to get really bogged down to the fact that they love etymology. And you will have these huge digressions about how you get a particular word, and they will, kind of like work back, and they'll say, and that is why a manacle is called this, and you're like, great, I've just lost 20 minutes of my life. You don't necessarily need to be interested in that. But one thing that I tend to do with manuscripts, if I'm really trying to come to terms with them, I will often commit myself to at least 2 readings of something. And I'll say, okay, I'm going to read the whole thing as it's meant to be read, taking notes of the things that I actually find useful. And then I will go back and then read the useful bits again. Once I've kind of got the gist of it, once I've got an idea of what it is the author is trying to get across to me, I can then go in and pick out the things that are useful to me. And there's absolutely no shame in that. And it's honest to God, most historians, when we are presented with a document, we're going in and looking for the thing that proves us right. So, we're kind of...
That is a very refreshingly honest take on it.
We'll go and we'll go skim. Oh, there's a word that I'm looking for. Great. What does that have to say? Skim. You are allowed to do that. You don't have to. You are someone who wants to use a sword manual to learn how to sword fight. So go do that. Don't worry about, becoming the world's foremost expert on this particular manuscript or this particular book. What you want to do is learn how to apply that to your life. And it's not the way that we think about books now. So don't burden yourself by bringing a 21st century understanding of books into it. Allow yourself to skip around, allow yourself to not read, allow yourself to skim, and you'll actually have a more comprehensive idea of it as a manual if you do that, I think.
Interesting. Okay, that's I have a couple of colleagues who I know are going to be jumping up and down going,
no, I know. Well, hey, so I think it's really interesting because, as a historian, I wouldn't do that. But I think that if what you want to do is fight, then fight, baby. Come on.
Yeah, fair. Okay, well, you've heard it. You heard it from the authority herself, chaps. You can just fight. You don't have to worry about all this book learning nonsense. Excellent. Okay, now I have experienced secondhand your glorious rant about the notion of the Dark Ages, and yeah. And the thing is, in what we think of as the Dark Ages, or what is commonly called the Dark Ages, there isn't anything in the way of actual sword fighting sources. But I do have many friends and colleagues who are nonetheless trying to recreate the fighting arts, given the equipment that they've got, and given, so they know what the armor was like, they know what the swords were like, they figure out how they would kill each other wearing this armor and using these weapons. But we have been indoctrinated at school with this kind of notion of the Dark Ages, and I would like an inoculation, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Go for it.
I guess for what, and this is an educated audience, so, who is interested in the medieval period. So I think that everyone listening would probably know this, but it bears repeating, that the Dark Ages only refers to the early medieval period. And when we began using the term Dark Ages, historians, we don't mean dark as in a pejorative. We don't mean dark as in bad. We mean dark as in occluded. We mean dark as in there's not a whole lot of sources. We mean dark as like, okay, well, here's the sword. What do you think we were doing? We have to do a lot more work in order to illuminate what was happening.
So hang on, you're not. It wasn't just because it was cloudy all the time.
I know. I know. And, the problem with the kind of conception of the Dark Ages that people have a lot of time is, in the first place, they think that the Dark Ages means the medieval period writ large. And in the second place, they think that it means bad time. And so, you'll see things like, for my sins, I am on Twitter. And I did kind of like have to get into it with an individual this week who was trying to refer to the 17th century as the Dark Ages the other day. Because, some stuff happened that she didn't like, and therefore it was the Dark Ages. And I'm like, honey, that's not even the medieval period. Like, pull yourself together. So, it's one of these things where people will use it in this offhand way to mean like, oh, bad time. And it's like, babe, all those modern things that those things that you're complaining about that you don't like are modern. And there's a lot of like really sophisticated, interesting things happening in the early medieval period, and it's actually, I'm obsessed with it. It's not what I study by any means of the imagination because I'm very lazy, and I don't want to do all the work that my fine colleagues
I've always
do.
said martial arts are for lazy people.
Yeah,
if I wanted to actually like work hard, I would go and do boxing or something.
Oh
but,
God, yeah.
Just poke them with a sword.
Oh yeah, it's a great step in the right direction, I think. And I get really interested when you see things. So, for example, when you'll have tales of particular kings. So the French king Clovis, for example. You have these great stories about how everyone is supposed to be lining up for a military inspection, and someone comes in and his armor's all rusty, and then and he took a vase that Clovis wanted, so Clovis like cuts his head off with an axe. And I'm just like, great, wow, okay, interesting. But what that does show you is that there are kind of like things like military inspections. That there's this idea that you're supposed to keep your armor up to a certain standard. You're supposed to keep your weapons up to a particular degree, and it tells us you get these little clues about what it is that people are kind of expecting.
Sure.
And all of this is actually evidence of this really rich world that has a whole ton of stuff going on. But fundamentally, man, it was just a really long time ago, the early medieval period. It's like over 1,000 years ago. And so yeah, you've got to expect along the way we lost some books, we lost some things that were written down, because where are you going to keep it? Like, what's the building that has been going since 476 that we're going to keep all of these texts in? Explain that to me. There's a lot of things that happen, and especially with something like martial arts, where it's a very live thing, in the medieval period. It's very much about the way that society is organized. It's very much about the way particular groups of people orient themselves in the world. That's something that's happening constantly. So, you might not need a manual like that when you've got an actual teacher standing in your yard, that sort of thing. So, we unfortunately, it's to our detriment that we don't know anything about this time. It's not that this time was bad so that we don't know anything about it. When we began using the term Dark Ages, what we meant was that this is a lament. This is what we could have had if we knew more about it. Not, oh, well, that time period was awful. I guess that we can all just skip over it.
Yeah.
We'll just fast forward this bit, and unfortunately, because of the fact that we don't teach medieval history, because we do have a kind of fetishization of the Roman Empire for all sorts of colonial and imperial reasons, it has allowed us once again to pat ourselves on the back about the people that we are better than and say, oh, well, you don't need to know about those Dark Ages when everyone was, being stupid and not being good like Roman centurions, And,
I should introduce you to some Smith friends of mine who reproduce like migration era swords.
Oh my God.
And with modern forges and heat control technology and access to steels of a purity undreamt of, right? They struggle deeply to come close to the level of execution that some of these blades have.
Yeah, it's these are people with immense skill, undreamt of in our time. And it bothers me so much to see, over a millennium of humanity just written off as, stupid, not worth your time. And then patting yourself on the back and saying, but I'm not like them. I'm very smart. It's like, how can you possibly say that there's 1,000 years worth of people that you're better than? It just doesn't make any sense, when. And, to a certain extent, although, like yourself, I'm doing much more early modern, like a late medieval kind of early modern work. I think that there's absolutely no reason for us to speak about people who are doing immensely complicated things under conditions that, we could never deal with either. I'm not trying to be living on a 2-field system without the heavy plow, get enough food, going and make this sword. Are you joking? Like, there's all these obstacles in their way, and yet they're able to create these amazing things. And it just bothers me so much when we denigrate them,
Well, I there's one reason why I don't do sort of 9th, 10th, 11th century martial arts. Ain't got no sources.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So I just go where the books are.
Exactly.
So that to me, that's the only reason.
Yeah, I mean that's my approach to history. The reason why I'm a late medievalist is it's the same thing. It's simply easier. There are just many more documents. They survive in much higher numbers. There are things sometimes. I say, oh, I should have been a Carolingian. It's just because Carolingian minuscule is really easy to read as a text. And
that's not a bad reason to take up a period. Actually, being able to read the sources really does help.
I gotta say, every time I'm struggling over yet another Batard script, I'm just like, my God, I wasn't a Carolingianist, But there are a lot of wonderful things that you get just from being able to have the sources, and I am not afraid to admit that I'm simply lazy, and and I don't want to dig around that hard for sources. Thank you very much. So,
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the word medieval is often used sort of pejoratively, as in, get medieval on him. And I know that you have feelings about this.
Yeah.
And I'm also aware that many of my listeners may not have, we have sort of overlapping fields of influence, I think. There's a whole bunch of people who do the sword stuff and do the medieval stuff, but don't really do the medieval history stuff. And so one of the reasons I wanted to get you on here is so that they could be exposed to this other kind of huge area of expertise and places to go for information and that sort of thing. So what's wrong with the word medieval?
So the word medieval, in the first place, a lot of people don't even kind of take the time to understand what it means. So medieval literally means the between times, right? So what it's saying is that it's in between the ancient world and our own. And in and of itself, I think that term is problematic because it kind of like indicates, when you say that, a lot of the time, the modern world, looks more like the medieval world than you would think. In the 17th century, for example, there are a lot of things where there's huge overlap. And I also think that one of the problems with it is that it really keeps the sort of medieval world at arm's length. It says, okay, well, we're done with that now. And I kind of even really struggle. It's easy to say when the medieval period starts. We all say, 476, when Rome falls. But even that's problematic because, if you asked people who were living in 476, they don't look out their window and say, oh, it's a whole new time now. Everything has changed. Oh, like this is different. For all intents and purposes, sure, maybe government is kind of like run out of a different city. It's no longer in Rome, but does that necessarily mean everything has changed? Or, if you talk to people, for example, in Constantinople, they'll be the first to tell you that they're the Eastern Roman Empire and that absolutely nothing has fallen and they're confused about what you're talking about. Yeah. Same thing at the end.
And they're still using the same. I mean, the Sestertius was used for like another 500 years, was it, as a store of value, and kind of a way of indicating value?
Absolutely. And I mean, if you go over to Constantinople and you see things like, the Nika riots that happen, because everyone was so deeply into chariot racing, you would be incredibly pressed. The Nika riots are a series of riots which happen because some members of a particular chariot team were sentenced to death. It's very complicated. Go look it up. You're going to love it. But
so can you just spell that for us then?
So it's Nikia riots. It means victory in Greek, and it's something that people used to shout at chariot races. Right. And so Constantinople has enough people that it's still like running huge chariot races. It's still got like, riots where thousands of people can be killed. For all intents and purposes, you go there, it's very clear that the Roman Empire hasn't fallen, and that time doesn't work like that, right? Same thing with the end of the medieval period. I don't even know what that means, so certain people call it different times. So no, you can say 1492, that's a useful date. The beginning of the Columbian Exchange is one thing that you can do. Say, okay, well, here it's a new time. I often say 1519. So, Martin Luther. But also, I think that that's a really difficult one because, as someone who does a lot of work on Czech history, the Hussites had already done it. They'd already made a form of Protestantism. They have a whole kingdom going on Hussite religion.
Which is conveniently forgotten by.
Yeah. No one wants to learn Czech, is what that comes down to. So again, historians being lazy, we just kind of skip over that because all the documents are in Czech. Ooh, never mind. Let's wait till it's in German. And then when Germans do it, it's like, oh yes, great, fantastic. Yeah, here you go. So it's difficult to say. When does the medieval period end? We just kind of have a general vibe where things are.
And it varies from place to place, right? I mean, in England, Battle of Tewkesbury is sort of considered the last properly medieval battle. That's what I was told once. That's like 1473, I think, something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's that's a perfectly good way of doing it. You could do it. You
couldn't say that in Finland.
No.
And Finland, culture didn't really change much until the 17th century. So maybe you'd put it in Finland at like maybe 1650 as a kind of ballpark figure.
Exactly. So, every single place you go, and, again, this is one of the reasons why history and medieval history is so complicated, is that all the cultures are so different that it's simply the same things aren't true everywhere. And so one of the problems that happens, with this complicated thing, with the fact that they're, all the edges are blurry, time periods are something that historians have made up to make our lives easier. It's an easy shorthand, to say, oh, I'm a medieval historian. And everyone goes, gotcha. I kind of understand what that is.
Yeah, that's knights and horses and peasants.
Exactly.
Right.
And I'm like, you're not wrong. So that's really easy and useful for me. But the problem with it becomes when you want more definitive answers. And the problem becomes when, again, we've got this kind of post-Enlightenment idea of the way that we tend to think of the medieval period is, again, shorthand for bad. Oh, that's a pejorative. So people will say, oh, well, something's so medieval when, it's particularly violent, which is, I'm sure this must drive you up a wall as someone who works on martial arts, because it's like, well, of course, things are violent, but, as opposed to what? As opposed to now, I would argue.
As opposed to crucifying slaves who rebel.
Oh, yeah, which was, perfectly fine and very civilized because, everybody loved that, or as opposed to, if we look at the body count of wars that we have now, and it's much higher. We have a lot more actual kind of innocent bystander deaths, now than
really?
we I would say, of course. Oh, wait, no, there's knock-ons. I'm not saying that like every time a field gets burnt down, a bunch of people are going to starve to death, but look at the body count of World War II, And,
when you say now, if you mean World War II, then sure, I'm with you. If you say now as in 2020, then
no. But also I'm also a historian, so I'm like World War II just happened. Sorry, it's still on TV. So these things in the modern era can actually be argued as being like much more violent, much more terrible. Every time someone gives me an example of something that I will agree is bad about the medieval period. So, for example, like rampant anti-Semitism in the medieval period that leads to things like pogroms where communities of Jewish people are killed. That's awful. So is the Holocaust, and which we
it's not like we forgot how to be horrible.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of times we're just being horrible more efficiently, and so there will be this kind of, abhorrence of medieval violence because it is a lot more sort of person on person, like one person looking another one in the eyes and sticking them with something pointy, as opposed to sort of like, oh, well, it's kind of all happening over there. There was a bomb, that sort of thing. So actually the way that we kind of organize organize the violence in our world now, a lot of times it's a lot more deadly. It's a lot more, it can be a lot more wide ranging, but we just accept that because it's kind of like the air we breathe. We're saying, oh, well, that's fine. And what's bad is man on horse with a sword, right? Because it isn't that it isn't scary. And I'm not saying that, medieval society wasn't violent, but I mean, it's according to whom and compared to what, I don't think that we've got to a point in time where we're in a non-violent society. So, let's not go throwing medieval people off of a bridge because, we don't want to think about what it is that we're doing. And this is the problem with, medieval as pejorative, is that you see it consistently used anytime something happens that people don't like. I see it over and over again. People will refer to, for example, whatever Donald Trump has done now. I don't know. And people will say, "Oh, well, this attitude is so medieval," and I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" It's like, this is the most modern thing I've ever seen. What are you talking about? And I think that it's actually really dangerous when we use medieval to describe things that we don't like, because what it does is it keeps things that we're doing at arm's length, and we say, oh, well, this isn't a reflection of us. This is a reflection of an earlier society. It's not a reflection of how things are now. And it keeps us from kind of actually seeing the commonalities that we have with medieval society, of which there are many. We still have a lot of things going on from medieval society, which are perfectly fine and great and nice, and we kind of overlook them because we say, oh, well, no, these are bad, violent people, and you don't want to be associated with them. And it also gets us off the hook for our own problems and the things that we've actually done. Because if we say, oh, this is medieval, then you don't have to fix it. You just have to say, oh, this is not a reflection of who we are, and you move on.
Yeah, and here's a really common misconception I come across all the time, is that somehow in medieval times, violence was a lot more sort of unstructured and anything goes and no consequences. And yeah, okay, we didn't have a police force, but you couldn't just go around murdering people and get away with it all the time unless you actually were somebody extremely high up in rank.
Oh yeah, yeah. And absolutely, a lot of the time, the way, even though there's no police force, what actually happens is that, societies and the communities are a lot more involved in making sure that violence is kind of kept in check. So, you have a much more systemic ways of looking at violence within the community, is that you tend to look at the community and you tend to look at it less like, okay, well, this is necessarily like a legal issue. It's more of a communal issue. And yeah, it's illegal, obviously, but that's not the problem with going around killing people. The problem with going around killing people is, that's, so that's, it's a bad thing to do. So, you see various ways of, policing that, where it'll be, people are responsible for, sometimes you'll see things where you'll have, for example, communities organized. So there'll be 10 men and you're all responsible for each other, right? So if one of you commits a crime, the other 9 have to go hunt him down and be like, hey, get back here. This sort of thing. So, you're also kind of watching each other all the time, being like, you're not going to hurt anyone, are you? Because if you do, then I have to, and there are all these like really great and interesting ways of that the medieval people, related to violence and related to each other and related to their communities. It's not like a random chaotic sea of violence. Actually, it's a community where, certainly violent stuff did happen, but, violent stuff's happening now. So, what do we mean by that?
Excellent. Now, you do have a book coming out called A Short Graphic Guide to the Medieval Period.
I do.
Now, graphic can mean many things. So would you care to tell us something about the book?
Yeah, so it is not, a comic book or graphic novel, but it's in that vein of things. So essentially, it's just a cheeky run through of the medieval period for people who are interested in kind of getting the basic building blocks of it. And it's got fabulous art is what it comes down to. So it's part of the Icon Graphic Guide series, which oftentimes is more aimed at kind of like philosophical conceptions and that sort of a thing. Mm-hmm. So, you'll have a graphic guide to Buddhism or a graphic guide to Foucault, or things that exist. So, but I got to do the medieval period, which is great. So it is one of these things where I think if you're interested in getting a kind of more comprehensive overview of medieval history, but you don't want to commit too much time, I won't be offended. It's a nice introduction. So it's about 176 pages with, as I say, gorgeous pictures. So it allows a kind of good overview. It'll get a solid place to start. It's got a really comprehensive reading list as well.
Well, I was going to say the bibliography might be.
Yes, the bibliography is a good place to go. But if what you want to say is, oh, here's this gap in my knowledge, because again, it's a gap in most of our knowledge because of the way that we relate to medieval history. It's a really good starting point. So it's aimed at an adult audience, so it will be out early 2021. I'm just my illustrator, who's so incredibly talented, is still working on it, and which is a joy for me because I get to see his updates. But I'm really excited for everyone else to see it. And if you are interested in kind of broadening your knowledge, but don't want to dive right into, a full book, then I think this is a great way of doing it.
Excellent. And so when it comes out, be sure to drop me a line and I will let everybody know.
Oh, thanks so much, guys.
Or maybe we'll get you back on here to tell us all about it.
Oh, yes, please. That'd be fantastic.
Okay, now I have a couple of questions to sort of wrap up with. My first, and I ask these of pretty much everyone because we always get some interesting answers. What is the best idea you've never acted on?
Oh, God, that's such a good question. I suppose that I have so many, as someone who is an academic, but there is a group of my friends and I my friend and I wanted to do another. We were thinking about having it as a graphic guide, but we don't know how we do it now. And we're currently kind of like wondering if we can do it as a zine. My friend and I want to do a guide to a medieval art history, teaching people how to read art in the medieval period.
Yeah, do it.
Yeah.
Do it now.
Yeah. So, because, there's a whole vernacular and a whole language that is present in medieval art that, people are actually
super helpful for like interpreting how fight books might actually be trying to represent information. And yes.
And it's one of those things where, it's so funny, as a medieval historian, obviously, I spend all day hanging out with these things and I know about like what I can look at a painting and say, oh, this is that saint. He's doing this. Okay, well, we're indicating here that this person is higher than that person. Okay, well, obviously this has been done at this time because of the way the art looks. And, I just know that because of years and years and years and years and years of work. But people who don't have the benefit of, over a decade worth of research, oftentimes, there's a whole medium, there's a whole thing that they're missing here because we've sort of lost that ability to read pictures. So what I want to do, my friend, Dr. Sarah Obergstradel and I want to somehow get something out in the world where it's just a quick guide of how to read paintings.
That's a great idea.
We're struggling with that.
We still know how to read paintings, or pictures, but we know how to read like a meme.
Yeah, okay? Exactly.
Like when my children show me a meme, very often they have to explain what it means because I'm missing all of the context.
Yeah.
But then I show them a meme from like 10 years ago and they don't know what it is because they don't know the context either.
Yeah.
But once you explain the context, oh, that's really funny.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of these things too, where I always argue that one of the reasons why, for some reason, the place where medieval historians are popular is like online. We get a lot of love, and I think it's because medieval people are meme masters. Like medieval people are memeing all over the shop, and so because we spend a bunch of time looking at what medieval people do, we understand how to bring medieval things into meme culture. And so, I think that. That's kind of like the hook so I'm going to do it. I'm going to figure out how to do it, but I just have to figure out how I'm going to do this. So, but we're going to get there. And I think that once everyone can kind of like come along on the journey of like understanding what it is that medieval people mean when they draw something, then, it's going to it'll illuminate a lot for people.
So you're going to have to come back on a third time then?
Yeah, obviously. It's never ending at this point.
Excellent. Okay. Now my last question. Somebody gives you £1 million to spend improving medieval history studies worldwide. What do you do with the money?
Oh my God, imagine. I think that one of the things that I would do with it is that I would kind of have bursaries for people who were interested and needed to do kind of more immersive work. One of the big things that I would love to do is kind of like more outreach with regular people. I'm a big believer in actually just talking to the wider public and not a bunch of academics. I think there's no real point in doing history if you're talking to the same 7 people all together. So, what I would love to do is, something where you could have kind of like more Adult learning classes, for example,
Mhm.
pay people to say, okay, well, one night a week, come learn about X, about the medieval period, and have that be that something that people could come to, but the teacher is paid, but they don't have to pay. They could just kind of come hang out. That would be great. And I
I'm
guess,
all in favor of paying teachers.
yeah, let's pay teachers, baby. Unfortunately, they're not paid enough. It's kind of really
I know.
shocking. I know. And I think that I would like to see also more digitized manuscripts.
Oh,
Uh,
yes. You're
if
talking
I
my language now.
Yeah, if we could digitize a bunch of manuscripts just so that they are something that we can all access online. Oh my God. Like every time I find out that a manuscript is digitized, it's like, an angel gets its wings,
That's right.
because, not having to get on a plane, not having to get on a train to go somewhere to have a look at something, and granted, there are still times when you do actually need to
You
go
really
see
need
it.
to do that, yeah.
But, a lot of initial work or, knowing that something, for example, is just a dead end or knowing that you can learn more from it because you could see it online first. Huge game changer. So I would just absolutely pour money into the digitization of manuscripts. And for people who don't already have it, because, places like the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, they've got endless resources for this and they're doing it and they're doing a great job. But what about, smaller libraries? What about, the smaller collections? And it's those smaller collections that, I think we could really use having online.
So you must be familiar with the Wiktenauer.
Yes.
Yes. That's yeah.
I get so excited every time, I see these things because I just really do believe that access is one of the biggest issues that we have
Right.
in terms
Yeah,
of.
I mean, I remember when it used to be that the only people who got to see any of these books we were working from are the ones who owned a photocopy.
Oh my God, yes.
And
Yeah.
there was a shitty photocopy at that.
Yeah, and you can't read it because it's been like a photocopy that's gone through four
Right.
different times, and yeah, exactly.
Yes, and that was the best we had,
Mhm.
and we were grateful we had even that. And now you can get like 800 DPI scans, and you can see the pores in the skin in the vellum.
Being able to kind of zoom in on
Oh yeah,
when you can't figure out what that word says, and just being able to kind of zoom in and out until I love it.
and you can see where the ink's been scraped away and a line has been redrawn.
I just, if we could just have more of it, I would just, yeah. So I would say adult education courses that people can just come to, and I want those manuscripts online. That's where the money's going.
Excellent choice. Right, well, thank you very much, Eleanor. It's been a delight talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Guy. It's just such a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. You can find the episode show notes at swordschool.com/podcast, where you will find transcriptions, photos, videos, and links for this episode. You can find a direct link to the show notes for this episode in the description. Join us next week for another cracking conversation. See you then.